Hi everyone, and thank you so much for once again tuning in. It's Wednesday night, and it's time for more questions and answers. This week we have a very special guest, Mr. Brian Fox, the minister at the Flippin Church of Christ, is here with us. Hi, Brian.
Hello. Appreciate it, Neil.
Man, I'm so happy you could be here with us.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Last week Colby came on.
Yes, sir.
And I gave him a really loaded question. And I did that on purpose because, well, it's just Colby. We love Colby.
Right.
And I just thought of all the people I could do this to, I'm happy to do it to him.
That's right. He was able to handle it well.
He did.
He did.
And we've got tough questions tonight, but nothing like that one.
Sure.
And so I'm excited about getting to them. For those of you that are watching for the very first time at home, you can submit questions. TompkinsvilleCoc@gmail.com is our address. There's no question in the Bible that's off limits.
No.
That doesn't mean we have a satisfactory answer to
Right.
all of them, or even really anything other than an I don't know. Because some of your questions that I don't know.
Sometimes we just don't know, and we have to be able to accept that sometimes.
I don't like that, but
I don't either.
and I think people at home don't like that either.
No, I know they don't.
But there are questions we can answer tonight. And the very first one came from a young lady here at the congregation. And she asked, do I have to fast? Should I be fasting? And I think the implication is, am I commanded to fast in the New
Right.
Testament? As a Christian, is that something I'm supposed to be doing?
Right.
So I'm going to let Brian take it away, my friend.
Sure. Well, Jesus was asked the same thing. Over in Matthew chapter 9, when you look at verse 14, it says, Then came to him the disciples of John, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but the disciples fast not? Now, Jesus responds, can the children of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then they shall fast. Now, that is the implication that it was done for a time of mourning. Jesus is giving that for us there. He also, along with that, gives a couple of examples that you really are not tying anything on the old and with the new. Now, many scholars believe that. I believe it is the case there as well. It's giving that point. Mm-hmm. First, let's look at the purpose of fasting. The Jews and the Pharisees of Jesus' day were fasting, we know, twice a week, on Mondays and Thursdays. And Jesus, in his very first Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, makes an implication of that. And I want us to look at that before we go any further.
I think we have it on the screen.
Yeah, that's good. Yes. In Matthew 6, now this is Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus talking to the people, the first time we know of him and making his introduction as being the Son of God. It says, Moreover, when you fast, be not, we've got it there, do not, as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. So let's look at the example of here that they are fasting, but they're doing something in a way to make sure that everybody knows that they're fasting. And so we have to be careful with that, because he says there, don't be as the Pharisees or scribes or Sadducees. He says, don't be like the hypocrites.
That's right.
So there is a purpose for fasting, sure. Now the question is, what is fasting? That's simply of not taking any of the food or sustenance that we need. There are some people that physically can't do that, diabetics, things of that nature. The first commandment that we have for God's people to fast is in Leviticus, for the Day of Atonement.
Sure.
And that was a purpose where a high priest would then go through. It was on their Sabbath. I believe it was the 7th month, 10th day of the month. But we see that is the only time that the Israelites were commanded to fast. They then implicated or then made a tradition to where they added to that, where they done it twice a week. Now, can that be a bad thing? No, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But they were doing it for a wrong reason. For they disfigured their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. So they were changing something that God had used for a purpose, and to make it something to make themselves look more holy or righteous in the sight of men.
But I like looking holy in the sight of men.
Sure, we all do. But Jesus warned that if we're going to fast, do it for a reason. And he would give it, as we looked in Matthew 9. Now, other cases, Saul was fasting. We have cases where the elders at Ephesus fasted when they were making decisions. Paul and Barnabas would fast when they were going to appoint elders in different cases. So we have the implication that fasting is something there, but it's, well, I think we've talked enough, and it's sort of like the foot washing deal. Is there a reason of example that we could do something of that nature? but are we commanded to do something of that nature? Right. And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. I personally have known of a couple that said they have fasted in the past, but they don't command them, and no one knows when they're doing it. We naturally will fast in the sense of a time of sorrow or a very severe illness that would become our nature, and we don't want any food. We don't have an appetite, and others around us encourage us to try to take food. But for something that we're commanded to do, that's not something. We're to worship God because our high priest is not like the high priest of the old. Our Day of Atonement is something that is done renewing all the time.
Sure.
So there's not just a one time of year that we have these type of situations or a religious, should we say, ceremony that's allowing for that. We have a continual cleansing through Christ's blood, who is our high priest, that is entering into a place not once a year, but daily. And our bodies, as Romans 12 would indicate, that we're to be worshiping God as presenting our bodies a living sacrifice.
Yeah, all the time, not just
all the time,
not
just one day a week, or not twice a week, not one time of year. That is something that's a continual thing. That it's more important that we're worshiping God and presenting our body as a living sacrifice daily, instead of doing those things. And the same thing can be applied to that. The taking the Lord's communion. Some other people believe in just doing things once or twice, or once a month, or
once a year to make it special.
Yeah, and that's not something that is to be implied. Can a person, would they sin if they fasted? No. The fasting is something that would be a personal. Romans 14 indicates and tells us, for some that would want to esteem something better, let that person esteem that. But you're not going to be able to bind that or condemn someone for not doing or doing what you're doing. So,
do you think probably, and I'm just obviously, there's a value to fasting, but it's an individual value?
Absolutely.
If it helped me draw closer to God, I should do it.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't mean it'll help you draw closer to God.
Exactly.
I think another example that pops up in my head, David, didn't he fast?
Absolutely.
When that baby was sick?
Right.
He didn't eat anything. He got up and he worshipped, and then he went and got food.
Exactly. Exactly. Same scenario.
There's like some repenting, drawing close to God. Yes. I do know of one friend who used to fast, and he told me about it in confidence, and so I won't dare share who it is.
Exactly.
But he would fast, if I remember correctly, from Sunday night to Monday at lunch. And so the thought was, after worship service, I don't want to lose my connection, my appreciation for God. So I'm going to not eat dinner that night, not eat breakfast that morning, and then I can still be on that. It's hard for me to do that.
Sure, it's hard for a lot of people to do that. And if you have a health issue, I fail to remember what the exact terms is for some of these individuals, especially people with diabetes or something that can't do those things. But I totally agree that it is something that can be done, and perhaps I would encourage people to try it. But do it so that we understand that it's for a purpose of getting closer to God. And I think that's what it was commanded for at the beginning.
Yeah.
And that's what we should use it for today. A time of mourning, or a time of drawing closer to God, or a time of connecting with our inner self to see where we're at and to renew our faith. But not to be done, as Jesus warns about, to appear it, to look it, and to make sure that everybody sees it. And that's something that we need to be in all things, and not just fasting.
And this is in the section where it says when you pray, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you can fast. Don't fast like hypocrites.
Right.
And if you're going to do it to draw close to God.
Right.
But don't feel that it's the only way to draw close to God.
Right.
Is that fair?
Exactly. I believe it's 100% fair.
So I think we can tell everyone, especially for the young lady that asked, if you want to fast, fast.
Sure.
Especially if you do it for the reasons to pray more, study more, give more devotion to God. But don't feel you are shirking a responsibility that God commanded you to do. The second question that was asked, which is really kind of loaded, and I should have given you this one. What happens when we die? And you're a preacher, and you've been a preacher for more than 6 months.
Right.
So you've been asked this question before, and you've preached a lesson about this. I have too. The afterlife is a question we all think about.
Sure.
Years ago, just a little background to this, some of you might have purchased the book Heaven is for Real. It was written by a guy named Todd Burpo and his son Colton. And the story goes is that Colton had an emergency appendectomy. And while he was under, he visited heaven. There's also another story called The Boy Who Died and Came Back. Well, that book, the author has said we made it up.
Right.
And a lot of people have attacked the heaven is for real people. And look, I'm not here to question those people's sincerity. What I'm here to say is both of those books sold over 1 million copies.
Exactly.
The movie that was made, Heaven for Real, had over 100 million in ticket sales.
Right.
People who are in the church, who read the Bible every day, people who don't, are fascinated with what happens when we die.
Exactly.
Just today, I saw a meme pop up on my Facebook page. Do you want to know what happens when we die? Cross this line and you'll find out. And it was on a military installation.
Right.
You know, even in a lighthearted, joking way.
Right.
Man, we're thinking about the world to come. And I can't help but think, you know, when we ask this question, everybody's mind goes to how we define it kind of like a society.
Exactly.
You know, everybody talks about waiting at the gate for St. Peter to let you in.
Right.
You know, heaven is clouds and we wear angel wings. And All Dogs Go to Heaven is the classic movie I remember watching as a kid.
Sure.
You know, this is a topic that people are concerned with.
Sure.
And I heard someone say one time, we're so obsessed with it because we've never been there.
Right.
If we could just dip a toe into it.
Right.
And appreciate it, just even in the slightest amount, it wouldn't be such a mystery, and our minds wouldn't be so obsessed with it. A couple of years ago, this research group called Pew Research asked something like 100 million Americans, what are your thoughts of the afterlife? Overwhelmingly, like 90% said we believe there's a good afterlife waiting. Now, a smaller percentage said there's a bad afterlife waiting.
Right.
But almost 95% believe something awaited us when we left this world. Now, look, I don't know what we want to call it, but we can call it the afterlife.
Sure.
But I feel like that's a disgenuine statement because everything you read in Scripture, life continues on. It just changes locations.
Right.
And there's story after story we can look at. We're going to in just a minute. But I think a little short survey of the Bible helps set a few things.
Exactly.
So I want to start in the Old Testament. I want to paint a picture of what the Old Testament looks like in the afterlife. It's kind of murky.
Yeah, it is.
It is not clear cut like we want it to be.
Right.
And we want to think that David knew about heaven and hell. Solomon knew about heaven and hell.
Exactly.
Job, sitting there in his ash heap, was like, just let me go to heaven. That's not what they were doing.
Right.
They talked about the grave.
Right.
Specifically the word Sheol. It appears 65 times. And in most of the instances, there's no real, I guess, qualitative description to it.
Right.
It's not a good, bad place. It's just the place we all go to.
Right.
Probably the greatest example that I can think of is Genesis 43.
Yeah.
And Jacob is talking to his boys that are remaining. And you remember the story. Joseph's been sold. And they're going to Egypt.
Right.
And Joseph asks for Benjamin.
Yeah.
And Jacob's like, no, you can't take Benjamin.
Yeah.
He's all I've got left.
Right.
And I feel like they always thought that was probably an insult to their face, but he's all I got left.
Right.
And remember, he consented, and he let those boys take Benjamin to Egypt to get grain, to bring it back home, and they stood before Joseph, all the story. Well, Jacob warned them. He warned them very specifically, if harm befalls him, if something happens to this boy that is my only living connection left to the one I love, to that love of his life, okay?
Right.
He says, what will happen? Then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow.
Right.
This idea of death being down,
Right.
being the grave, that's the overriding idea in the Old Testament
Right.
of the afterlife.
Right.
And Job talks about going to Sheol. Going to the grave. Solomon, David, they mention it in the Psalms, in the poetic literature. It's there.
Exactly.
They referenced it. But occasionally, just occasionally, they talked about it this way. And I appreciate this passage, Psalm 9:17. The wicked return to Sheol. Okay? Even with the nations who forgot God. Look at this idea of returning. I think it's obvious that they appreciated it as kind of a place of the soul.
Right.
We come from it. We go to it. It's where God brings us forth, okay?
Right.
You get to the New Testament, and it changes.
Yes, it does.
But it's not the apostles. It's not preachers.
No.
And it's not the religious leaders. It's literally Jesus.
Exactly.
And I've always, it's ironic to me. You know, two things he talked about the most in Scripture? What happens when we die and how we spend our money.
Yep.
Do you think those things might be connected? You know, he's the one that said it's easier for what, a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, isn't it?
Exactly.
Now, I honestly think that kingdom of heaven, he's talking about there's the church.
Sure.
But let's look at big, broader picture. The church leads to heaven.
Absolutely.
And Jesus talked about those things. Now, we could look at a lot of things. Think about the sheep and the goats. You can talk about the narrow, the wide path. Colby and I talked about both of those last week.
Right.
But there's one story, and it's Luke 16, and we can't take time to put it up here, but if you're at home, I know we're going to turn to it. Luke 16 is the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Now, a lot of people believe this to be a parable, but I have to reject that for two reasons, okay? First and foremost, in all parables, Jesus spoke very, I think allegorically would be the right word. Generically might be a better choice.
Right.
There was a certain man. It was never Brian Fox was walking from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And, you know, they were universal, applied to people at all times.
Right.
This story's not necessarily universal.
No.
It's these two guys.
Right.
Now, granted, we can go to one of those places, and so there's some universal truth to it.
Sure.
But it's not a certain guy did this and a certain guy did that. It is very much Lazarus did this and a rich man did that.
Right.
So, a couple things worth pointing out, because I think this answers what happens when we die.
Sure.
Okay? And it might not be the quintessential classic, you go to heaven, you go to hell. But this is the biblical answer.
Right.
Now, Jesus starts talking in verse 19. Now, ironically, I've said all this, and he starts out with, there was a certain rich man.
Right.
So beg me just a little bit, okay? There was a rich man clothed in purple, fine linen, fared sumptuously, and there was a beggar named Lazarus full of sores.
Right.
This teaches us one thing first, that we all live in a world where not everyone is treated fairly.
Right.
Okay? You know, the sun rises on the righteous and the unrighteous, the poor and the rich, and it also sets on them.
Exactly.
This story is about the sun setting on these guys, okay? But what they have in common is they were born into the same world.
Exactly.
Same opportunities, although one might have been more plentiful than the other, and the same ability to give God honor and praise. Okay?
Exactly.
So free will choice, just like you and me. Okay. Now it goes on to say in verse 22 that the beggar died, was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and being in torment in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. 24 says that he cried out. That'd be the rich man.
Yeah.
Okay. Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus, he may dip the tip of his finger in water, cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Abraham goes on to say, remember in your lifetime you received good things and Lazarus bad things. Mm-hmm. Now he is comforted, you are tormented. Beside that, there's a great gulf that's fixed.
Right.
So those who want to pass from here to you cannot, and from you to there cannot. Now, we can unpack for probably hours
Sure.
what's going on here.
Absolutely.
But I think that it's easy to see two things. These men died and left our world. And they went to another world. That world had things that were similar. Okay? They felt.
Right.
Their existence didn't stop. Okay? They were still identifiable.
Right.
Lazarus knew who the rich man was. Or, well, we assume. We know the rich man knew who Lazarus was.
Exactly.
And I think if it goes one way, it probably goes the other way.
Right.
Forgive me if you don't like that I'm assuming that, but I think that's a fair assumption.
I think it is.
They felt pain and comfort.
Right.
Okay? But what's obvious to me is this is not after the day of judgment.
No.
Now, if this is true then that means I think we can safely assume they're still there today.
Sure.
That they went to this place, and maybe this is a cheap analogy for it, to wait.
Yeah.
Like we do when we wait in a lobby somewhere.
Exactly.
It's not their permanent home, and it's not where they started. But it's that, I don't know, go-between
Right.
from their home now and their eternal home then.
Right.
A lot of people don't like this story because it's not easy.
Right.
It's easier to just say, I died and go to heaven.
Right.
Or they died and went to hell. And the one thing we can all agree on is people like Hitler are in hell, right? But there's a wide range of people who get to go to heaven.
Right.
Sometimes that sweet little lady who never hurt anyone gets to go to heaven, but also that dirty rat who we can eulogize correctly in the funeral gets
Right.
to go to heaven.
Right.
So what does this say? Well, it shows that there is an element of judgment.
Right.
Okay? So when you die, you're not eternally judged. I think that's fair, because there's no day of judgment.
Right.
But their actions were weighed in the balance.
Exactly.
And one was found wanting, the rich man. And I think we can assume, if you'll let me assume,
Right.
that he had every opportunity to love God and serve God, but did not.
Exactly.
Trusted in his riches and his wealth is the epitome of it's harder for a rich man to go to the kingdom of heaven than the epitome of that.
Right.
Lazarus, who would have had every reason to reject God, didn't.
Exactly.
Now, I wish there was a verse in there that talked about their character, that Lazarus never missed going to offer a sacrifice, that
Right.
it's not there.
Right.
But when Abraham says, look, he is now comforted and you are now tormented, that is a judgment upon their circumstance.
Right.
You had that and you wasted it. He did it, and now he has this and you want it.
Right.
So, the immediate answer to what happens when we die is we go there.
Right.
Okay? And our life is put in essentially a measuring device. And it's weighed, it's counted of value or of being wasted.
Right.
Now, the connection to this might be Jesus talking to the thief on the cross. You remember that guy was a dirty rat, okay? Yeah. He said, we deserve what's happened to us.
Exactly.
Yet, when he asked God to remember him today when he comes into his kingdom, what did Jesus say? Of course you can. Today you'll be with me in paradise. Implying an awful lot. Today you're forgiven, your sins are wiped clean, all of that.
Right.
Now, this guy was a Jew, not a Christian.
Right.
This is the Son of God speaking, so things can be said, and let's be honest, this might be a bit of a special circumstance.
Sure.
But Lazarus and that man have a lot in common.
Exactly.
Their destination, not necessarily their occupation in this world. And I think because we look at heaven as just in the afterlife as a continuation of this world, we associate, well, preachers and do-gooders go to heaven.
Right.
Criminals and sinners go to hell.
Right.
But I tend to reject that.
Yeah.
That there's, this soul and this heart that God sees and judges.
Exactly.
The book of Job is all about what our heart is.
Exactly.
And because Job suffered, all of his friends made what conclusion? You're a dirty rat. You are an immense, despicable person who hid this from us.
Right.
And God is just giving you what you deserve.
Right.
And when God speaks out of the whirlwind, he says, who clouds my ears with stupidity?
Right. Exactly.
You guys are dumb. That's essentially what God said. Even Job said, I spoke things I didn't understand.
Right.
And in that moment, we learned that this world is not a reflection physically of the world to come.
Right.
There are some things that carry over. And I think they're on us. Feeling, knowledge, emotion.
Right.
Those things carry over. And the world to come, let's be honest, it doesn't seem to be permanent. Okay?
No.
It's 1 Thessalonians, I think, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I know that you've got that marked. We were talking about it earlier. It talks about really the end of time. And I think there's a reference there. If you want to read that to these people.
Absolutely. 1 Thessalonians is chapter 4. And it says there in verse 13. Now, remember, in looking at the background of Thessalonians, they were very confused.
Absolutely.
Because of some misteaching, some misunderstanding. And their idea was that, okay, we're now Christians. Christ's coming back again. So we'll just sit around and do nothing and wait for him to come back.
It's a good idea inherently.
Yeah.
Just sit around, twiddle your thumbs, and wait for Jesus to come back.
It's just not practical, and it's not what God and Christ want us to do.
No.
So he is, in his first letter here, is coming to this idea because I know I do, and I've studied, been fortunate to the Bible for many years, as you have, and as many others have. Mm-hmm. And we still have those questions, and we can't help but ponder them, and there's nothing wrong with thinking about them. But so Paul wants to straighten some things up. He says, but I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, and those, of course, that are passed on, that you sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. So here's two different classifications of people. There's some that have hope, some that don't have hope.
That's right.
If we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so also which sleep in Jesus, will God bring with him? God's going to bring him with him from where?
Well, not here, because they're asleep.
Exactly. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. So we're looking at the situation of me and you today, those of us that are watching, and those that the Lord is going to prevent them which are asleep, as Lazarus in the situation we were looking at earlier. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first.
Now, who would that possibly be?
Well, see, there's where we're looking at the situation and that we've looked at it in Lazarus. Wherever this place is of waiting, and you know, to be honest with you, all of us are very guilty at different times of hearing things all of our lives, whether it be from good people, whether it be from preachers, whether it be from things, and we assume all those things to be real. You know, and that's not, we're all guilty of that in some way, whether it be with biblical or not, just in all things of life. And we've done that because we've had the picture that we see of heaven in the book of Revelation, and we still want all that stuff to be physical, and we apply that to everything that we have. And Jesus even said and had a hard time when talking to the disciples and the people, the Jews, nothing about this is going to be physical when it's all said and done.
Right.
We fail to see that the bigger picture in the book of Revelation is that when we are there, the people there in heaven are there around the throne of God and worshiping God for eternity. So we have that tied into us, but yet we want names, and we want the exact picture all painted out for us to have. And my ways are above your ways, my thoughts are above your thoughts. We can't interpret a sign. It's hard for us to imagine something that we can't really put physical things on.
And we only know physical things.
Absolutely. It's like with time. How do you understand eternity?
I don't.
It's hard for us to imagine
I don't.
2 days or 10 years or whatever.
I'll turn 40 this year.
Yeah.
That seemed ancient to me not that long ago.
Exactly.
And now I think it seems really young.
You're very young.
So, 1 Thessalonians. Jesus is going to come back.
Exactly.
There'll be this day of judgment. And the Old Testament talks about day of judgment. And it's always, not always, most of the time it's here.
Right.
But it's presupposing something bigger. It's always talking about Jesus, the day of judgment, Jesus coming back.
Right.
So there's this end of our life here. But until that day gets here, those who died go somewhere.
Right.
Now, that seems to be Luke 16, thief on the cross. I think we can assume that's where Lazarus, Jesus' friend, went, who died. Where Stephen went, where the apostles who died.
Right.
That's where our loved ones are.
Right.
They are in this place that's not eternity, but it echoes both our world and eternity.
Right.
You know, you feel and know like you do here, but there's this large element of punishment and a reward that's divided there.
Right. Right.
So it really almost stands perfectly between both worlds.
Exactly.
This earthly home and then our eternal home.
Right.
And, well, I know that might seem kind of deep, because it is.
Yeah, it is. It is very deep.
And it's not an easy answer. It's not just, all right, I die and go to heaven.
Right.
Very rarely is God's answer an easy answer.
Exactly.
And it's usually not complicated, but it's complex. And it requires more than just my gut feeling.
Exactly.
You think about, I say I love God. Well, what does that mean?
Right.
Well, it's not the same as I love my children. I love L8. I love a Dovey burger or my wife.
Right.
It's not the same thing. And the afterlife, where we go when we die, is not as easy as the cartoons want to depict it. I get hit in the head with an anvil, and I float the sky with my wings playing my harp.
Right.
It's not that easy. But it's more rewarding, I think, to me.
Sure.
For I leave this world of toil, and I go, and I have a time of rest before I get to spend eternity around heaven.
Right.
And I don't think we need to think that it's a place where God doesn't dwell. Psalms say, where can I escape from your presence? Exactly. So obviously God is there.
Right.
But we look at it in terms of it's where I go to rest. And in that way, the Old Testament really had it right. It is the grave.
Exactly.
Now, maybe they didn't see the positive and minus side, but they were really
barking down the right path. And we need to as well. We just need to know that heaven and hell are as real as this world and that world.
Sure.
And getting to the afterlife is more important than what will happen when we get there.
Exactly.
And how we get there matters. And so while I appreciate the question, what happens when we die, I'm more concerned with what happens while we live.
Exactly. Because that's what we can change, and that's what we can do. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. You remember in Luke 16, he said, the rich man, send Lazarus to my brothers so they don't come here.
Exactly.
What did Abraham tell him? Look, they have the Bible.
Yeah.
If they won't listen to the Bible, they won't listen to a dead man.
That's right.
Now, I kind of tend to think that I might listen to a dead man. But Abraham knows better than we do.
Exactly.
From his perspective there, he knows better.
Right.
And so, folks, Jesus gave us the answer what happens when we die. And while it's not the socially acceptable answer,
Exactly.
it is his answer.
It is the answer.
The third question, which I think we probably got a minute to answer this one, but I want to answer this. A good friend of mine from Mayfield, Kentucky asked this question. He said, did Adam and Eve have children in the garden? I'm going to let you take that one.
Well, I mean, the one that's, it's hard for us to understand some things we don't know.
I don't know.
I mean, it's time and the way things were recorded. You've got to remember, Genesis and all the first 5 books are written by Moses, and he is writing an accounts given to him by God well after some of those things, and there is no way to know many of those things.
All it says is that at the end of chapter 3, they were kicked out of the garden.
Right.
But then chapter 4, verse 1, Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's chronologically accurate. It's not and I need to correct myself on that. It doesn't mean it is concerned with being chronologically accurate.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
I think it's safe to assume that it is chronologically in order of how people were born.
Sure.
But it's not concerned with getting the dates right.
Right.
Because the dates don't matter.
Right.
It's big picture idea.
Right.
I always struggle with people who try to read science into the Bible. Yes, science there, but it's not a science textbook.
Right.
Don't use it to prove stuff that we know to be true
Exactly.
that it's not concerned with proving.
Right.
Same thing with mathematics or literature. What's there's there, and don't read too much into it.
Right.
I'm always concerned with people that have to believe Job's talking about dinosaurs.
Right.
He might not be.
Might not be.
He might not be.
It's not meaning that he's not, and
Yes.
it's not. It's a good point, in talking about this, to where after the sin or the fall of man, that Eve is told what her position will play in that.
That's right.
So it's not that I would disagree with the descent to make it a matter of a barrier between me and someone else, but we're really not. I really would not say for 100% the other way either, and say yes, they did.
The only evidence I think that would suggest that Cain may have been born in the garden is consider that when God gave her punishment, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children.
Right.
That doesn't mean she had given birth before when he said I'll multiply.
Right.
But I won't automatically exclude that he didn't either.
Exactly.
And so, do you want to hear the answer? We don't know.
I'm sorry.
There's evidence to suggest maybe they did.
Right.
There's evidence to suggest that they didn't, and there's no foundational thing to say we know for certain either way. Talking about Eden, and we could go on for this. We really need to kind of start winding down. But how long do you think they were in the Garden of Eden? I've heard people say they think they were there for days.
Yeah.
I've heard people say they think they were there for decades. And I tend to think they were there longer than we want to believe.
Right.
It takes a while for your guard to drop.
Right.
And let's be real honest. Their guard dropped. That's why they ate of that tree.
Right.
Some people have tried to say, well, they just ate of it because they were kids who didn't know better.
No.
And I think that sin gets closer and closer and closer. What does temptation say?
Right.
It wears you down to where you get close enough that it suddenly doesn't look wrong.
Right.
And I think that's so true of that story.
Exactly.
So they might have been there for years. So could he have been born there? I won't reject that.
No.
But man, we're never going to know.
We're never going to know.
So I'm sorry to disappoint everyone who wants to know a definitive answer to that. We just don't know. We do know you can fast, and maybe you even should fast.
Right.
But God hasn't commanded you have to. We do know we go someplace when we die. It doesn't appear to be our eternal home, but we go to a place where we wait that has echoes of this world and that world.
Exactly.
And we know that Adam and Eve lived in Eden and they had children.
Right.
We just don't know if they had children when they lived in Eden.
Right.
So I'm so happy that we could do this tonight. Brian, thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you. I appreciate it.
I
very
hope we
much.
can do this again.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
Although it'd be nice to not have to do it again.
Well, yeah, under the circumstances, I wouldn't mind doing these, just not with all the other stuff.
I'm
that goes
afraid
on.
we're not going to get back into our church buildings for a while. And
Doesn't look so.
for those of you at home that are looking for a glimmer of hope, I'm not going to give it to you because I'm afraid it won't be. But we can still worship and study, and we can grow
Absolutely.
closer together doing this.
Absolutely.
The church has always evolved and adapted.
Exactly.
And it's our turn now.
Right.
So thank you for watching. We will see you again soon.